is April 16th. It is DC Emancipation Day. And there are a lot of celebrations that are going on. Some are going on right now. Some are going on throughout today. Some you can catch on Sunday. The big DC Emancipation Day parade and concert is going to be going on Sunday, all day Sunday on Pennsylvania Avenue. And this is the flyer for it. This was not a holiday for most of our lifetimes. So you might not necessarily exactly know what it is or how it got to be a DC holiday. And you might also be a little confused as to what it is with Juneteenth. So I thought that today might be a good kind of quick primer as to what the difference is between those two and how it connects to AOI as we talk about our AOI history. So I'm not sure if you can see it particularly well, but on the left is April 16th, today, celebrating DC Emancipation Day. The DC is a very important part of that. So that commemorates April 16th, 1862. And that is the day that President Lincoln signed the DC Emancipation Act. And that abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. It's also an important note that the slave trade had already been abolished in DC in 1850. So in this kind of weird gray area, slavery was still legal in DC, but the slave trade, the buying and selling, had been illegal since 1850. So this is the first time the federal government passed any legislation to abolish slavery. That's what makes it incredibly important. It is the first, it predates the Emancipation Proclamation by about 10 months, so that's why it is important. It is also the only and first example of compensated emancipation in the entire country. So to add insult to injury, the good news is that enslaved people have their freedom. Kind of bad news is that the federal government's going to compensate not the enslaved people, but their, quote, owners, right? So the federal government paid out over $1 million to compensate the, quote, owners of over 3,100 people who had been enslaved in the district. So this day celebrates the day that was signed into law, and that was the official ending of slavery within the District of Columbia. This will not be an official holiday. It was declared a holiday in 1996 and did not become an official DC government holiday until 2005. So these dates are pretty recent. So a little bit to be confused sometimes with Juneteenth. So Juneteenth celebrates June 19th, 1865, almost 3 years later. And this is the date that is recognized as the time that enslaved people in the westernmost Confederate state, which was Texas, officially found out about their freedom through the Emancipation Proclamation. This is when Union troops came and read the Emancipation Proclamation and let them know that they were no longer legally enslaved. So that was in Galveston Bay. So that was an official Texas holiday in 1979, and that became a federal holiday in 2021. So all of these are recent. So it's celebrating essentially the same basic idea, which is the abolishment of slavery, but it is doing it on 2 different days. So DC celebrates both, and you will see that as both. One is a DC government holiday, and one is a federal holiday. And you'll note from these dates, so this is June 19th, 1865. The Civil War, Appomattox, the surrender at Appomattox has already happened. That is April 9th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln is shot and dies April 14th and 15th, 1865. So this is 2 months later, 2 months that after all of that had happened, that people are still enslaved in Texas when that is abolished. So that gives you some idea as to how each of these had been celebrated and how kind of messy the quote, ending of the Civil War was. And it is into all of that that we do have an AOI connection. And one of these connections is from the first citywide celebration of DC Emancipation Day, which happened in 1866. So this was the first April, the first time to celebrate the Emancipation Act after the end of the Civil War. And it's also only about 3 weeks after the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed. And the Civil Rights Act itself was the first to identify that all people born in the United States were considered citizens, so birthright citizenship, and that there were equal rights for all citizens born in the United States. So it was landmark legislation. So 1866, the city explodes with celebration. It had to be delayed by 3 days because it was really muddy in the city. We were still dealing with infrastructure issues, but they were still happy. So there was a parade. There were bands. The parade winds around through the White House, and the president gives a speech. It is only so-so received because it is President Johnson at this time. It's not President Lincoln. But he gives a speech. They wind around by General Grant's headquarters. They go by the Capitol. They end in Franklin Square, and there are troops, the U.S. colored troops that come and are presenting. And there are about 10,000 people who celebrate in the city at this time. And it is well covered, and it is well kind of received for it. So this was so important in 1866 because of this. This is covered by Harper's Weekly. This is the first time in these types of numbers that African Americans can gather in the city of Washington legally in this type of way to celebrate. This is the first time to reclaim public space since the Black Codes that restricted how and where and why and when African Americans could gather in the city. So this is a reclaiming of political rights. It's a reclaiming of public space. There were signs about voting rights for African Americans. So there is a lot after 160 years that we're dealing with today that this could look like a no kings protest or a political protest that is going on in Washington. And you would see some of the same signs and some of the same issues: birthright citizenship, voting rights, and kind of reclaiming public space. So it's fascinating to me that has gone on. So the symbolism of it in the city, the recognition by the federal and the local government is also incredibly important. And AOI was literally created in the midst of this. So AOI was less than 4 months old and was still working on its own constitution while that parade was going on. So the constitution for AOI would not be adopted until May, so only about 2 or 3 weeks after this that the constitution for the organization was adopted. So these founders were still reeling from the Civil War, from Lincoln's assassination, from the upheaval in the city, from changes to its population. The city is going to more than double over the course of the decade from 1860 to 1870. The social and the racial makeup of the city, the instability of Reconstruction and the Civil War in the city, and also a Congress and a White House who had competing views of what Reconstruction was going to look like and what rights for all was going to look like. Joseph Bradley gave us a speech to AOI, one of its first, to its membership in July. And one of the things he talks about was saying that we're in the midst of another revolution, not less momentous than that which was inaugurated 90 years ago. And he talks about these discordant elements. And announcements about AOI were talking about the fact that people felt like that they were strangers in a strange land, and so many new things and new people happening. So that is what AOI comes out of. That is where it is born, literally, and its constitution and the first meetings that they had. So this is all on their minds. Did they participate in Emancipation Day celebrations and the parade? Maybe. We don't know. Did they object to the parade? possibly, as all of this was going on there. We haven't yet done enough digging, which is why we're looking for volunteers for the preservation. But since Benjamin Taylor, who had been president, literally lived on Lafayette Square, and this parade and the president were all going through Lafayette Square, they had to know about it. They saw it. They were in the city. Most of these guys live downtown. So whether or not they approved or disapproved or went outside and waved a flag, we don't know. But they certainly were at least aware of it. The parade itself is going to happen yearly from 1866 to 1901. And Frederick Douglass himself will be a keynote speaker at least a dozen of these. But by the 1880s, there were competing visions. Yes?
Cindy, quick question.
Tim?
Do we know whether any of these AOI founders were slave owners who were compensated in 1862?
We do not yet. So thank you for volunteering to do that research. Because that is a good question. I like that. So we know that some of the founders and some of the original members were former slave owners. So we do know that because some of them, especially William Bradley, when he died, there were items in the newspaper about how wonderful and what a great friend he had been to the black community in Washington. And yet, some of those accolades were from people who were formerly enslaved by Bradley and his family. So, again, there's a lot of mess that's in there. So it would be very interesting to know whether or not they are on that list. And there are lists for that. So.
The government did pay reparations at one time.
They did. And so there are absolutely rolls from the Treasury Department that we can look at. Great question. It's a great idea. No, we're gonna find that out. We like that. So by the late 1880s, there were competing visions as to what the celebration should look like, what the parade should look like, and there seemed to be divisions among even the African-American community in D.C., somewhat like, if you recall Derek Gray talking about this when there was a split in the NAACP and different competing visions about what some of civil rights should look like and activism should look like in the city. So there does seem to be a class issue that was a division between people who had been working for the federal government and were educated and people who were laborers and service workers and oftentimes had come in and were not multi-generation Washingtonians. And that ended the parade in 1901. There was no more parade for that. But we don't know whether the AOI founders were there, but we do know that AOI Inc., which was established in 1912, which was the African-American counterpart to AOI, thought that this date, April 16th, was important enough that they adopted it as their Founders' Day. And they also had their annual banquet every year on April 16th. And this is I don't know if you can see it, but that's from 1921. And William Nixon, who was president in the 40s and through the 60s, early 60s, was a huge advocate for Emancipation Day celebrations. So there was a need. It's not that Emancipation Day wasn't celebrated. It was celebrated with lectures and church services and at banquets, but it was not a huge citywide celebration with the parade anymore. So there was advocacy on that behalf. So how did we get it back? Mostly after 100 years, it was thanks to Loretta Carter Haynes. She was an educator who was with Reading is Fundamental, if you know that program, which started here. And she came across mention of the parade and the celebrations. And so she started advocating through the 80s and 90s. She was educating, she was lobbying, she was laying wreaths at the Emancipation statue on Capitol Hill. She was doing awareness campaigns in schools with her son Peter, as well as with the historian C.R. Gibbs. They would go out, they would have. In 1992, they had a ceremony at Freedom Plaza that was sponsored and supported by the National Park Service. So she was steadily growing ground with it. And it was thanks to her that the parade was brought back in 2002. Unfortunately, she was too ill to attend that parade in 2002. She would eventually live till 2016. So she did get a chance to kind of eyewitness some of what was going on. But it's mostly thanks to her And the acknowledgement of the day is in a big part thanks to Vincent Orange, who is a former DC council member, who introduced the legislation and also sponsored and tried to get that through. When it returned in 2002, on April 16th, it was over 90 degrees on that day. As it is. And they did have in Franklin Square, which was the site of the original 1866 celebration, they had a concert with Chuck Brown, so there was go-go music. And Frederick Douglass IV, the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, was on hand to give a speech as well. So, it slowly grew. It wasn't that popular at first, but they eventually, by 2006, got to be about 10,000 people. And just this year, they're moving it. They announced like a day ago that they're moving the celebration to downtown because they're expecting so many people to turn out for Emancipation Day this year. So I think as we look at AOI and its creation and the mission that it has to kind of recount history and to recount its memories and to preserve DC history, but also to create community, because it has done that as well, I think we see that that seems to be an inherent part of the DC culture. We see that with trying to resurrect the DC Emancipation Day, for acknowledging it, for making sure that everybody knows about its history, for sharing the education. So I think AOI came out of this kind of turmoil, but is also inherently a part of that turmoil and a part of that sense of reclaiming and making sure that people understand what happened in DC, the honest history of DC, and making sure that that gets passed down from generation to generation. So that's my connection with AOI and Emancipation Day. And there's some great books if you're interested in learning more about both Emancipation Day, that era, and Reconstruction in DC. If you're interested in any of those, let me know. I can get you more information on